It's my pleasure today to welcome you to this webinar from YPSA, the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism. My name is Jeff Alexander, and I'm a professor of sociology here at Yale and a board member of YPSA. It's my honor and privilege, as well as a real personal pleasure, to welcome my friend and colleague, Chad Goldberg, to speak today. Chad is the Martindale-Bascom Professor of Sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the author of many articles and important books of original research and theory. But before telling you about some of these, I want to tell you how Chad describes his research areas on Wisconsin's sociology website. He describes them as, quote, modern Jewish thought, especially social and political thought, the civil incorporation of Jews as an ethno-religious minority in relation to modern state and nation building, and the sociology of anti-Semitism. I'm reading you this because I can assure you that it's most unusual. As far as I know, Chad is the only sociologist at a leading American department to describe his research specialties as devoted entirely to what was once called the Jewish question. In fact, Chad's first book was not about Jews, but about workers. It was entitled Citizens and Paupers, Relief, Rights, and Race from the Freedmen's Bureau to Workfare, and it won some important awards. It was in the years after that publication that Chad began attending to matters concerning Jewish exclusion and incorporation, one line of which culminated in his singular book, Modernity and the Jews in Western Thought. It was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award and the Jordan Schnitzer Book Prize, and the winner of several prizes from sociological societies. Chad has been a fellow at some of the world's most distinguished institutes for advanced studies, including the Princeton Institute, the Wissenschaft Kolleg in Berlin, and the Max Weber Kolleg in Erfurt. He's also been the George L. Mossey Visiting Professor at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Today, I welcome Chad to speak at Yale. His talk, as you know, is entitled From Multiculturalism to Anti-Semitism, Revisiting the Jewish Question in America. Chad?
Jeff, thank you so much. I want to thank you, and I want to thank Maurice for the opportunity to take part in this webinar today. Jeff, I want to thank you for that very kind introduction, and I want to thank all of the attendees who are here to participate as well. It's a personal and professional pleasure to be here with all of you today. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can share my screen with you, and let me go ahead and get started. My point of departure today is Jeff's work, actually, which has had a strong influence on me, and specifically his 2006 book, The Civil Sphere. Those of you who have read this book know that nearly 90 pages of its 550 pages are devoted to the Jewish question. As Jeff shows, the Jewish question arose in both Europe and America, but in these settings, the instabilities of Jewish incorporation were resolved in markedly different ways. I can't do justice in my presentation today to Jeff's lengthy comparison of the Jewish question in Europe and America, but suffice it to say that his discussion of the Jewish question in Europe concludes with the Shoah, while the corresponding discussion of the Jewish question in America ends with the emergence in the 1960s of a multicultural mode of Jewish incorporation. The startling resurgence of anti-Semitism in the United States in the last several years raises a host of questions about the rich and insightful discussion of the Jewish question that we find in the civil sphere. If American Jews have been the beneficiaries of a multicultural mode of incorporation since the 1960s, how do we account for the resurgence of anti-Semitism? Does it mean that Jeffrey Alexander's assessment of the Jewish question in America was overly sanguine? Alternatively, if the assessment was correct for roughly half a century from the 1960s until the 2010s, does the resurgence of anti-Semitism indicate another shift in civil discourse that is bringing the multicultural incorporation of American Jews to an end? Or is this an alarmist overreaction to what we should instead regard as a futile rearguard backlash and a temporary aberration from the multicultural incorporation of American Jewry? While the contemporary resurgence of anti-Semitism may seem to challenge Jeff's conclusions, I argue instead that his theorization of the multicultural incorporation of American Jews helps to explain the resurgence of anti-Semitism in two ways: by highlighting the inherent instability of the multicultural mode of incorporation, and by identifying new problems of boundary definition and identity that multiculturalism generates. If contemporary anti-Semitism is a backlash against multiculturalist trends that began in the 1960s, then it is a backlash that arises from the very problems that multiculturalism itself produces. I will develop this thesis in four parts. First, I'll briefly review the three modes of civil incorporation that Jeff has identified and the distinctive relation of Jews to civil society that each of those modes entails. Second, I will present evidence for a resurgence of anti-Semitism in the United States in the past several years. Third, I will trace the resurgence of anti-Semitism in part to features of the multicultural mode of incorporation that Jeffrey Alexander has identified. Fourth, I will provide additional support for this interpretation, if time permits, by means of a historical comparison to cultural attitudes toward Jews in the Calvinist or Protestant Reform tradition, particularly among the Puritans. And to be sure, the Puritans were not multiculturalists, but they did identify themselves with Jews to a remarkable degree, and this identification created similar problems of boundary definition and identity, which makes it, I think, an instructive comparison. So Jeffrey Alexander examined the Jewish question in relation to three ideal typical modes by which excluded outgroups have achieved incorporation into the civil sphere. The first of these modes of incorporation historically was assimilation, which entails the separation of the person who belongs to an outgroup from the stigmatized qualities that distinguish the outgroup from the core group. That separation was typically accomplished by means of a division between private and public life. Members of primordially stigmatized groups could participate in the discourse and institutions of civil society insofar as they completely shed these identities upon entering the public domain. Assimilation is inclusionary insofar as it permits the members of outgroups to be evaluated positively and thus affords them opportunities for civic participation, but it fails to challenge the negative evaluation of outgroup qualities. Furthermore, as Jeffrey Alexander wrote, because of its delicate and tense balance between negatively evaluated qualities and positively evaluated persons, assimilation is a highly unstable mode of incorporation. The instabilities of the assimilative mode of incorporation allow it to be pushed backward toward exclusion or forward toward alternative modes of civil incorporation. The hyphenated mode of incorporation began to emerge in the United States at the end of the 19th century, turning immigrants and their descendants into Polish Americans, Italian Americans, and so forth. Hyphenation is more open to, and it accords more positive recognition to foreign or outsider particularities than does the assimilative mode of incorporation. Nevertheless, it remains fraught with challenges for Jews and other outgroups. While ethnic particularities remain evident and pronounced in this mode of incorporation, the qualities of excluded groups are treated as complementary, but still inferior to those of the core group. Alexander concluded that the hyphenated mode of incorporation, like the assimilative mode, provides a highly unstable basis for the expansion of civil solidarity, and therefore is liable to be pushed backward to assimilation and even to exclusion, or else forward to the multicultural mode of incorporation. The multicultural mode of incorporation goes further and differs markedly from the assimilative and hyphenated modes of incorporation because it entails the positive evaluation of outgroup qualities, such as peripheral national origins, minority racial status, or marginalized religion. These primordial qualities, previously thought to disqualify their bearers from civil inclusion, become reinterpreted as representing variations on the sacred qualities of civility. Following the dilemmas and failures of the assimilative and hyphenated modes of incorporation earlier in the 20th century, Alexander argued, the instabilities of Jewish American incorporation were pushed in a multicultural direction from the 1960s onward. Simply put, Christian Americans began to find Jewish qualities attractive in themselves. Alexander's evidence for this claim was mainly drawn from American popular culture, including a close reading of the self-representations of Jewish cultural producers like the author Philip Roth and the actor and director Woody Allen, as well as demographic trends like intermarriage. According to this interpretation, Christian Americans in the post-war era came to view the identity of the previously marginalized Jewish outgroup both as, quote, legitimately and importantly different from their own, and at the same time as fundamentally the same, unquote. Multiculturalism, Alexander concluded, requires and helps to produce thicker and deeper forms of mutual identification. If American Jews began to experience a multicultural mode of incorporation in the 1960s, the country's erstwhile love affair with Jewish qualities seems to have taken a disturbing turn for the worse in recent years. The Anti-Defamation League, established in 1913 to fight anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry and discrimination, monitors anti-Semitic incidents in the United States, including assaults, vandalism, and harassment. ADL reports indicate a steady decrease in anti-Semitism from 2011 to 2013. However, the ADL reported a sharp rise in anti-Semitic incidents in 2014. This 21% increase from the previous year was the first time in nearly a decade of declines where the overall number of incidents substantially rose. Anti-Semitic incidents continued to increase in 2015 and then surged more than 1/3 in 2016, particularly after November 2016, when Donald Trump was elected president of the United States. The surge continued into the first quarter of 2017, jumping 86% during the first 3 months of the new year. The number of anti-Semitic incidents in 2017 ultimately rose to 1,986, a 57% rise from the previous year, and the largest single-year increase on record, and the second highest number reported since the ADL started tracking this data in 1979. The number of anti-Semitic incidents in the US fell slightly in 2018 before rising again in 2019, another record-breaking year. Rising anti-Semitism was exemplified by the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, where neo-Nazis chanted, "Jews will not replace us," and the murderous assault on the Pittsburgh Tree of Life Synagogue in 2018, which the ADL described as the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in the history of the United States. The record number of anti-Semitic incidents in 2019 included deadly stabbings or shootings of Jews at a rabbi's home in Monsey, New York, a kosher grocery store in Jersey City, New Jersey, and a synagogue in Poway, California. Anti-Semitic incidents declined slightly in 2020 and then reached an all-time high in 2021 that exceeded even the 2019 levels. Now, the other main organization besides the ADL that monitors anti-Semitic incidents in the United States is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI tracks hate crimes defined as an action of physical violence or vandalism whose motive is a prejudice against a specific group, and reports violence against Jews under the category of prejudice based on religion. The pattern of anti-Jewish hate crimes over time, though lower in numbers, is roughly consistent with the pattern in ADL data on anti-Semitic incidents. What we see here in this graph is that the number of anti-Jewish hate crime incidents decreased steadily from 2011 through 2014, a trend that the ADL welcomed. However, anti-Jewish hate crime incidents started to increase in 2015, rose again in 2016, and spiked about 37% in 2017. After falling in 2018, anti-Jewish hate crime incidents jumped by 14% in 2019, when they comprised 13% of all hate crime incidents, despite Jews constituting less than 2% of the US population, and fell again in 2020, though they remained higher than levels in the first half of the decade. While data on hate crime incidents in 2021 and 2022 were not available at the time this paper was prepared, anti-Jewish hate crimes continued to seize public attention with the armed taking of hostages at a synagogue in Colleyville, Texas in January 2022, and the arrest just last week of a man threatening to kill Jewish government officials in Michigan. The rise in anti-Semitic incidents and hate crimes is associated with a shift in cultural attitudes toward Jews in the United States. That's what I will argue at any rate. And I think there are worrying signs of such a shift on both the political left and the political right. On the one hand, the anti-Semitic motifs of Jewish foreignness or alienness, exclusive particularism, power, and wickedness parallel or correspond to anti-Zionist motifs that have appeared in the discourse of some self-styled progressives. For example, U.S. Representative Ilhan Omar has at various times claimed that, quote, Israel has hypnotized the world while doing evil, that congressional support for Israel is, quote, all about the Benjamins, that's to say, all about money, and that American supporters of Israel, quote, push for allegiance to a foreign country. Although Omar is widely regarded as one of the most progressive members of the U.S. Congress, these remarks earned her the praise of former Ku Klux Klan Grand Wizard David Duke. The reason for this is not hard to discern. Omar's rhetoric corresponds to at least two anti-Semitic motifs, one that money makes Jews powerful, and the other that Jews are more loyal to their own interests than the country in which they are citizens. Today, a segment of the American left uses the counter-democratic code and the discourse of civil society to taint American Jews who do not embrace anti-Zionism, which is, according to surveys, most American Jews, as bad Americans. The shift in cultural attitudes was strikingly displayed by the surge of anti-Semitism during the 2014 Israel-Gaza conflict, which went beyond mere criticism of Israel or Zionism to include assaults on Jewish individuals and vandalism of Jewish institutions. On the other hand, under Donald Trump's presidency from January 2017 to January 2021, the term globalist spread from far-right anti-Semitic websites into mainstream civil and political discourse. The use of the term as an anti-Jewish dog whistle received widespread attention in 2018 in connection with the resignation of Trump's chief economic advisor, Gary Cohn, and the attempted bombing of the philanthropist George Soros' home in New York. As Aryeh Tuchman from the Anti-Defamation League noted, the application of the term to Jews carries a host of associations that cannot be extricated from the history of anti-Semitism. Tuchman linked the term to long-running conspiracy theories about Jewish populations not being loyal to the countries they live in and cooperating through secret international alliances. The anti-globalist representation of Jews is in some ways antithetical to the anti-Zionist representation. Are Jews cosmopolitans or nationalists, we might ask? Nevertheless, the two discourses converge in constructing Jews as disloyal to the United States, secretive, powerful, and above all, anti-civil. The multicultural incorporation of American Jews that began in the 1960s makes the recent resurgence of anti-Semitism appear surprising and perplexing. While claims of multicultural incorporation seem hard to square with evidence of rising anti-Semitism, I will argue that Alexander's theorization of multiculturalism reveals some of the processes that underlie this partial reversal. Since, as Alexander makes clear, the multicultural mode of incorporation does not represent the end of an inevitable developmental or evolutionary logic, there's no reason to expect it to remain permanent. As Alexander conceives it, multiculturalism involves the paradoxical perception of difference as a variation on shared humanity, or the perception of outgroups as legitimately and importantly different from the core group, yet fundamentally, in some sense, the same. This paradox, he suggests, generates problems of boundary definition and identity that make the multicultural mode of incorporation unstable in its own way. What Alexander means by this becomes clear in his discussion of the paradoxical consequences of multicultural incorporation for American Jews. Christian America's multicultural embrace of Jewish qualities allowed, he wrote, confident assertions of Jewish difference, including a return to traditional religious practices in non-Orthodox synagogues, the growth of Jewish day schools, and the creation of Jewish studies departments and programs at American universities. Yet Jewish assertions of difference were accompanied by Jewish anxiety about the continuing viability of Judaism in America. The seemingly unwarranted anxiety was a response to the problems of boundary definition and identity that the multicultural mode of incorporation generates. And here I'm quoting Jeffrey Alexander, if difference can be recognized, Only when there is increasing solidarity between core and outgroup, it should not be surprising that even as they begin to cultivate their differences, Jewish Americans would come to feel more like non-Jewish Americans, and the latter more like them. In Alexander's account, it's precisely this mutual identification that creates anxiety about the loss of a distinctive Jewish identity. Rising anti-Semitism in the United States may reflect the problems of boundary definition and identity that Alexander associated with multiculturalism, but in a different way than he anticipated. If mutual identification encourages Jewish anxiety about the continuing viability of Judaism in America, then it is likely to foster an analogous reaction among Americans with a Christian heritage. In other words, to the extent that core group and outgroup identities are viewed as fundamentally the same, the non-Jewish core group will also experience anxiety about the continuing viability of its own identity, and perhaps even the national identity with which the core group has been historically closely associated. One way this anxiety finds expression is in renewed anti-Semitism, and especially anti-Semitic efforts to reestablish hierarchical boundaries that multiculturalism threatens to dissolve. If the multicultural mode of incorporation generates problems of boundary definition and identity for the core group, as well as for American Jews, there's no reason to think that these problems will be limited to core group members who are committed to one or another political ideology. The problems may, however, appear in somewhat different guises as a result of these political commitments. On the one hand, breaking with the historical self-consecration of the American core group, some core group members aligned with the progressive left are now inclined to view the core group as a deeply anti-civil oppressor of minorities and outgroups. This transvaluation of the core group by some of its own members has adverse consequences for the Jewish outgroup when Jews are perceived to be fundamentally the same. Instead of viewing American Jews as a marginalized outgroup that deserves their solidarity or allyship in contemporary political parlance, these core group members find it hard to distinguish Jews from other, quote unquote, powerful and privileged core group members. These core group members continue to see Israel as a little America, but their transvaluation of the American core group now makes this identification polluting. Rather than interpreting Jewishness as a variation on the sacred qualities of civility, these core group members may instead come to see it as a variation on the profane qualities of incivility. From there, I would say it's a small step to transfer their guilt to the Jews. Their tolerance, normalization, or in rare instances, outright expressions of anti-Semitism, I would say is the bad conscience of the core group. On the other hand, core group members on the far right try to maintain restrictive primordial definitions of civility, or even to make those definitions more narrower. Some of these core group members blame Jews for multiculturalism, for immigration, and other developments that they think threaten the American core group. Nevertheless, they identify with Jews in surprising ways, attributing to them an ethnocentric culture, which they believe advantages Jews and is at odds with the multiculturalism that they believe Jews foist on others. Their hatred of Jews is, in this way, conjoined with envy. This perspective shapes attitudes toward Israel as well. For instance, in 2017, the white nationalist Richard Spencer described himself to an Israeli journalist as a, quote, white Zionist, unquote, and insisted to the journalist that, quote, you should respect someone like me who understands your identity and the experience of the Jewish people and has analog feelings about whites, unquote. Notwithstanding Spencer's spurious analogy and distorted understanding of Zionism, these comments reveal the ambivalence of core group members on the far right who see Jews as a threat and simultaneously project their own wishes onto them. The portrait of the Jews that they offer to the world is, in fact, their own self-portrait. This theoretical argument about the American core group and its relation to Jews needs qualification in a few key respects, and so I want to mention those here. First, I don't want to suggest, and I don't mean to suggest, that the entire American core group has become anti-Semitic. Rather, problems of boundary definition and identity facilitate tolerance, normalization, or even outright expressions of anti-Semitism among core group members, making such expressions more likely within the group. Second, Christianity is only one of the primordial qualities available for defining the American core group and judging civil competence. Nevertheless, following Alexander, the Christian quality is analytically accentuated here because of its particular significance vis-a-vis the Jewish outgroup. And third, while this theoretical argument is about the core group and its relation to Jews, it raises questions about the growing minority of Americans who are religiously unaffiliated, which, according to survey research, now make up about 29% of all Americans, as well as the very small minority of Americans who are religiously affiliated, but belong neither to America's historically Christian core group nor to the Jewish outgroup. And survey data suggests that those Americans make up about 4% of the population. Many religiously unaffiliated Americans belong to the Christian core group by cultural heritage, even if they do not identify as Christian. They may have no use for Christianity as church or credo, but its cultural influence endures in the form of secularized Christianity. They are therefore likely, I would submit, to share in some form the anxieties that the multicultural mode of incorporation generates among other core group members. However, the anxieties of someone like Ilhan Omar would be more complicated, since Muslim Americans have arguably not experienced a multicultural mode of incorporation. Their identities may be more divided in a manner characteristic of hyphenation or even double consciousness. In addition, the relative success of the multicultural incorporation of Jewish Americans since the 1960s may lead such minorities to resent an outgroup that they perceive to have joined the core group. In my view, this is a mistaken perception. And it's mistaken, I think, for a few reasons. One, even in ideal typical form, multiculturalism does not simply absorb outgroups into an expanded core group. Rather, outgroups are paradoxically perceived as both legitimately and importantly different from the core group and as fundamentally the same. Second, the multicultural mode of incorporation takes incomplete or uneven forms in real civil societies, in part because it overlaps with past modes of incorporation that partly survive into the present. And third, and this in a way is part of the point of this paper as a whole, renewed anti-Semitism belies the assumption that Jews are now part of the American core group in any simple or straightforward sense. Let me turn to the last part of my paper here. And I hope you'll indulge me with this excursus. The multicultural mode of civil incorporation is quite new in the history of Western societies. Nevertheless, I think historical analogies can still be instructive. Despite the millennia-long Christian pollution of Jews as incapable of participating in the civic life of Christian societies, we can find exceptional cases in which members of a Christian core group identified in relatively thick and deep ways with the Jewish outgroup. Such identification usually involved a positive evaluation of not only Jewish persons, but also some Jewish qualities such as chosenness and biblical truth. In these instances, some Christians came to see Jewish identity as importantly different from the core groups and at the same time as fundamentally the same. Their views anticipated multiculturalism in this respect, even if Christian theological assumptions prevented their views from developing fully in this direction. Cultural attitudes toward Jews in the Calvinist or Protestant Reformed tradition, particularly among the Puritans, may provide the best example. Puritanism always felt its inner similarity to Judaism, Max Weber wrote, even if it also felt the limits of this similarity. Consequently, I will suggest Puritans experienced problems of boundary definition and identity similar to those generated by multiculturalism, and they managed the resulting anxieties in ways that illuminate the contemporary resurgence of anti-Semitism in the United States. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century gave rise to intense religious conflicts and sectarian struggles among Christians, in which each faction frequently accused the others of Judaizing. For example, a Bavarian Catholic preached in a 1551 sermon that the King of England, at that time the Protestant Edward VI, his council and kingdom had all become Jews. The Church of England soon turned the charge against its own internal dissenters, labeling Puritans as Judaizers in the late 16th century, and the association between Puritanism and Judaism was firmly in place as the 17th century got underway. But in this instance, the charge was more than a stigmatizing label used to discredit rivals. The Puritans were convinced that they were the true Jews, the ultimate and total heirs of the promises that God had made in the Hebrew Bible. And this strong identification expressed itself in a variety of Judaizing practices summarized by the historian Eliana Glazer. And I'm quoting Glazer here. Puritans attempted to strip away what they regarded as corrupt layers of episcopal authority and popish ceremonialism and reclaim the original apostolic Christian faith. They justified their position by invoking the Bible, and particularly the Old Testament, and they believed that Scripture should be read in the original Hebrew. Puritans advocated the use of Hebrew in biblical translation and scriptural exegesis, and they identified with the biblical chosen people. In addition, many Puritans became scholars of post-biblical Jewish literature, such as the Talmud, and most heterodox of all, some even began to adopt Jewish practices and customs, such as the Sabbath and Passover. Puritan identification with Jews created problems of boundary definition and identity analogous to those that arise in multiculturalism, which fueled anxiety about the continuing viability of their own religious identity. The Puritans consequently tried to reassert boundaries that had become obscured. And this is evident, for example, in conflicts over whether to readmit Jews into England and whether to admit them into the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The debate in 1655 to 1656 over whether to readmit Jews into England following their expulsion in 1290 was shaped in part by Puritan philo-Semitism and millenarianism. The public practices of Christian Judaizers and the growth of interest in Hebrew had already helped to put Jews in a favorable light among Protestant reformers, some of whom came to believe that the return of Jews to England would hasten the second coming of Christ. Not surprisingly, then, some of the most strident devotees of the mid-17th century Puritan Revolution favored readmission of Jews. The historian Roger Healy suggests that the readmission movement failed because not enough English believed that the Jews were future Christians and harbingers of the millennium. However, opposition to the readmission of Jews also sprang from a deeper fear, namely that it would result in the Judaization of Christians and thus the loss of a distinctive Christian identity. Among religious leaders, there were many who, like the Puritan pamphleteer William Prynne, believed that if the Jews were readmitted, the Christians, quote, would sooner turn Jews than the Jews Christians, unquote. One response to this boundary crisis was to keep Jews out of England. This symbolic logic is apparent, for example, in the writings of the 17th century political philosopher James Harrington. Although Harrington advocated a theocratic republic in England modeled on the Hebrew Commonwealth established through Moses, fear of Judaization led him to oppose the readmission of Jews. He proposed instead the establishment of a colony of Jews in Ireland where they could be profitable to the Republic, but safely separate from it. As the sociologist Kai Erikson points out in his classic study of deviance in Puritan New England, communities maintain their boundaries in geographical as well as cultural space. And here I'm quoting Erikson, both of these dimensions of group space, the geographical and the cultural, set the community apart as a special place and provide an important point of reference for its members. And the debate over readmission of Jews to England, maintenance of geographical boundaries served to compensate for the obscuring of cultural boundaries. Like the English Puritans, their counterparts in New England similarly struggled to redefine boundaries that their philo-Semitism threatened to dissolve. To be sure, identification with Jews was not the only source of boundary definition and identity problems in the New World, but Puritan identification with Jews threatened to obscure the cultural boundaries of the Puritan community in its own way and compounded anxiety about the continuing viability of Puritanism in America. Erikson analyzed the antinomian controversy of 1636, the Quaker persecutions of the late 1650s, and the witchcraft hysteria of 1692 as different attempts by the people of the Massachusetts Bay to clarify their position in the world as a whole, to redefine the boundaries which set New England apart as a new experiment in living. The inhospitable and exclusionary practices that New England Puritans adopted toward the handful of Jews they encountered in the 17th century may be understood in the same way. Although New England Puritans persecuted Quakers more severely than Jews, exclusion of Jews was rooted in the same symbolic logic. Here I'm quoting Erickson. It was exactly because the New England Puritans shared so many features in common with the Quakers that they had to publicize the few crucial differences as noisily as they could. To mark off a new set of boundaries for the New England way, they had to make a particular effort to emphasize those points where the Puritan and Quaker streams diverged. The New England Puritans' treatment of the Jews they encountered evince an analogous effort to mark off boundaries and keep a group with whom they shared many features safely separate. So in sum, Puritans were not multiculturalists, but they did identify with Jews to an unusual degree, and this identification generated problems of boundary definition and identity similar to those that arise from the multicultural mode of incorporation. Consequently, the Puritans experienced anxiety about the continuing viability of their religious movement and the loss of their own distinctive religious identity. If they saw Jews as future Christians, they also worried that they themselves might become Jews. The closer their identification with Jews, the more they found it necessary to keep Jews at arm's length. As the boundaries that set Puritanism apart threatened to become more obscure, they strove to mark off a new set of boundaries by excluding Jews from the geographical or cultural space that the community occupied. And this history, I would submit, finds its parallel in contemporary fears that Jewish Zionists and globalists are figuratively Judaizing America and in anti-Semitic efforts to exclude Jews from the civil sphere. To conclude, while there is persuasive evidence of a shift beginning in the 1960s toward a multicultural mode of incorporation for American Jews, the resurgence of anti-Semitism in recent years, in the form of a sharp rise in anti-Semitic incidents, as well as changing patterns of discourse and cultural representation, underscores the instability of this mode of incorporation. After a half-century of multicultural incorporation of American Jews, how and why is anti-Semitism now on the rise? A theory that posits the multicultural incorporation of American Jews would seem to have difficulty explaining the revival of anti-Semitism. But in fact, Jeffrey Alexander's analysis of multiculturalism provides important clues for understanding its partial reversal. His analysis acknowledged the instability of the multicultural mode of incorporation and traced it to the new problems of boundary definition and identity that multiculturalism generates. According to Alexander, these problems explained why American Jews felt anxiety about the continuing viability of Judaism in America, despite an unparalleled embrace of Jewish qualities by the Christian core group. What I have argued here today is that these problems of boundary definition and identity also generate corresponding anxieties among members of the Christian core group, and these anxieties are contributing to the resurgence of anti-Semitism in the United States today. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Chad. I'm not able to get myself on the screen at this point, but you can hear me, right?
Yes.
There we go. And I will answer them. I will ask them for you to Chad. Well, one question that might be helpful to answer is by David Freund. He asked, what is boundary definition?
Yeah, so I am drawing here on Jeff's work, but also in the work of Kai Erickson and some others, all of whom sort of emphasize the importance to groups and communities of having clear boundaries that set the identities of those groups apart, that distinguish them in some way, and allow the members of those groups to consecrate their identities, their ways of life, their practices as somehow special, distinctive, and worthy of difference. So I guess what I would say then is that the boundary definition has to do with how any community, any cultural group distinguishes itself from others, how it defines itself And any process of self-definition is going to involve a process of distinction, that it's going to, in some way, set itself apart from others. Not necessarily, I think, in an insidious way. I don't think that this kind of boundary work is inherently bad or detrimental to other groups. I think it's just part of how identity formation works. So that's what I have in mind when I talk about boundary definition. I hope that makes it a little bit clearer.
Yes, that's important for non-sociologists to get some of the terms out there. Here's another question for you from Rena Seltzer. She asks, how does the woke ideology, which promotes anti-Semitism by defining Jews as privileged oppressors, and through intersectionality, defining Zionism and Israel as colonialists, how does this woke ideology fit into your schema?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of debate about this term and what it means, and people use it in different ways. Some people use it very broadly. Some people use it in sort of more specific ways. I think I touched on this when I talked about members of, again, not all members of the core group, but some members of the core group who have been involved in what we could describe as a transvaluation of the core group itself. So again, the point that I tried to make, and maybe I went through this a little bit too quickly, maybe it was lost, is that what to me is a really interesting process, sociologically and culturally, is that you have people that are, I think, members of the core group, not exclusively, but some of them are core group members or have that cultural heritage, who have come to regard the core group that they belong to as deeply anti-civil. And so what I suggested is that my argument is less about the ideology. So I think the roots of anti-Semitism lie less in ideology than in these new problems of boundary definition and identity. This term that I borrowed from Jeff's work in his and civil sphere theory, which are really sort of cultural and structural problems generated by the multicultural mode of incorporation. So my argument is not really about the effects of ideology. I think maybe the way that political ideologies come into play here is that they mediate and they shape how members of the core group make sense of these anxieties and how they respond to these anxieties. And so there, I think we see some variation. And but I don't think that anti-Semitism is a product of one and only one political ideology. I think there's a variety of ideologies that we can find in the American political landscape today, and I'm struck and worried by what I see as expressions of anti-Semitism, or at least tolerance of anti-Semitism, on different sides of the political divide and the political spectrum. So there is a connection, but I wouldn't say, and I don't argue in this paper, that a political ideology, woke or otherwise, is the source of these problems.
Thank you. Now we have a question kind of from the opposite side. This is anonymous. He says the rise in anti-Semitism historically has been correlated with rises in income inequality and social unrest. Given the extreme income inequality in America today, do you think this plays or has played a role in the rise of anti-Semitism?
Yeah, interesting. I think so. I think the roots of anti-Semitism are multiple and complex. I think that there can be a conjuncture of different factors at work, and I think the globalist language that I talked about is maybe a way in which anxieties about growing economic inequality get linked to antipathy or hostility toward Jews. So this is a longstanding feature of anti-Semitism. When you look at this, Jews have been blamed or associated with the power of finance, with the power of money. You see this also, I mentioned in the talk, the way that this comes out in some anti-Zionist tropes, where again the power of money is emphasized, and I provided some examples of that. So this sort of parallels or corresponds to how these tropes have been used in relationship to Jews directly. So I think it is a factor. I think it's a contributing factor. I think it's linked with the factors that I emphasized or that I focused on in complicated ways. But I do think it is part of what's going on. The interesting question to me is, economic inequality has been growing for decades, and yet anti-Semitism was on the decline until much more recently. And so if you would say, well, anti-Semitism is basically a response to growing economic inequality, what then explains the timing? Why is it so delayed, given that these inequalities have been deepening for many years? So that's why I think by itself, this is not really a sufficient explanation, but it seems to me that it would have to be taken into consideration for any kind of comprehensive account of anti-Semitism today.
Great. This is a very good series of exchanges. Now I'm going to speak for Maury Samuel's question. After complimenting you for a great talk, quote, he asked this: "My question is how you account for the fact that anti-Semitism is rising globally, including in countries like France, which have not followed the same pattern of multiculturalism as in the US."
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. So the argument that I develop here is specifically about the US. And I think that's a good question. I think we need more, I am sort of a comparative as well as a historical sociologist. And so I think we need sort of more comparative research, because I agree with Maury that this is something that we see in many countries around the world. And what it suggests to me is that, again, that there are multiple factors at work. I'm reminded here of William Brustein's book, The Roots of Hate, which really tried to get at these sort of multiple manifestations of anti-Semitism and the different forms that it took and the different sources of anti-Semitism that sometimes come together. I think in the European context, I don't know how far I want to go in. So I guess two things I want to say about this. Maybe I hesitate to say too much because I haven't. This is a question that I'm not sure about the answer, and I think this requires more research. So I hesitate to say too much. But I want to say two things. First of all, I forgot to mention this at the beginning of my talk. This paper, I want to say, is part. I should have mentioned this before. It's part of a symposium that's forthcoming in the American Journal of Cultural Sociology. And those papers, I think, provide some of this comparative framing that you don't get in this paper alone. So my paper is focused on the US in particular. There's another paper that Jeff and Tracy Adams contributed to that symposium, which is really comparative in nature and tries to develop a kind of theorization about comparative variations that we see in expressions of anti-Semitism. And I think does it really insightfully, actually, in a way that's both historical and comparative. And then the third set in those, the third paper there deals with the Scandinavian countries. So you get a kind of cross-national perspective on anti-Semitism. And the other thing that I was going to say is, I don't know how widespread this view is, but I am struck by the perspective of some European-born intellectuals. I'm thinking of people like Alain Badiou, Matti Bunzl, and Enzo Traverso, who have insisted that Jews are now part of the core group, that after the Shoah, Jews became privileged insiders in European societies in Western Europe, privileged insiders of a dominant Judeo-Christian European or Western order at the expense of new outgroups, particularly Muslims. I'm quite skeptical of that argument myself, but I think that if I were going to explore the roots of anti-Semitism in countries like France and other European countries, I would want to make this part of the analysis. I would want to try to understand to what extent this view is widely held, and to what extent this view contributes to images of Jews as, in the current political conjuncture, reactionary and anti-civil. So this would be something I would want to explore further, I think. But I don't have a very good answer to your question, Maury, because I haven't done the comparative work myself.
Okay, this is a question from that kind of relates to this discussion from Diane Louie. Does the anxiety regarding boundary definition presuppose that the excluded group retains inferiority in the mind of the core group? That is there a pervasive stigma in the core group in being perceived as having intersectionality with the excluded group?
Jeff, can you read that one more time? I'm not sure I fully understood that question.
I don't think that, I don't understand this last sentence, but let me just repeat the first sentence because I do think you can address that. Does the anxiety regarding boundary definitions presuppose that the excluded group retains inferiority in the mind of the core group? In other words, I think they mean as it's being incorporated, speaking like you had just talked about.
Yeah. I wouldn't put it that way. Because I think what is distinctive about the multicultural mode of incorporation, as I understand it, is that those outgroup qualities that were perceived as stigmatizing in the past become increasingly destigmatized and even admired. I think what that does, it does fuel anxieties about identity and boundaries and sort of definitions of sort of the core group. And among some core group members, I think that leads to an effort to reassert hierarchical boundaries that multiculturalism tends to dissolve. So I would put it a little bit differently. I think this is not quite how I would understand things.
Okay, I'm going to now translate a question from Yada de Leon. Could you expand on how other outgroup communities, especially Black American communities, contribute to and or push back against this resurgence of anti-Semitism? I'm especially interested in hearing more about the resentment aspect that you'd mentioned.
Yeah, also an interesting question. Again, here I can be only tentative. I haven't done the work, the research that would allow me to speak really authoritatively about this. My sense, my impression is that within other outgroup communities, there is sometimes probably a feeling of resentment to other outgroups that are perceived to be more successful. But I think that I don't think that it would be fair to say that sort of is the be all and end all of attitudes in those other outgroup communities. There's also the possibility and sometimes the realization of solidarity among those outgroups, even when those outgroups have sort of different relative degrees of sort of successful multicultural incorporation. And I'm thinking in particular I'm thinking in particular of an incident that happened on my own campus several years ago. There was an anti-Semitic incident on campus. There was a kind of a sort of a teach-in that was held about it. And I remember the teach-in was attended by lots of students. Some of them were Jewish, some of them were non-Jewish, and some of them were African-American. And initially, the discussion sort of started to fall into this groove that you sometimes see in these kinds of conversations about sort of who has suffered more historically. And I think these discussions are always kind of pointless. I don't think they really ever serve anybody well. Also, I don't know how you would sort of quantify degrees of suffering. So it sort of went in that direction initially. But by the end of the evening, I was struck that some of the same people who had sort of begun this way had moved to a different way of talking and had begun to identify with each other in a way that they, I think, maybe didn't at the beginning of the evening, and had begun to sort of identify some commonalities in their experiences. So their experiences were by no means identical. I don't want to suggest that they are, but they began to see some commonalities, and they began to see each other not as sort of competitors in terms of claiming the title of who has been most wronged historically, but as people who shared not identical conditions, not identical situations, but situations with enough elements shared in common that they could begin to perceive a way of working together to move the campus in a more inclusive direction, and to work together to do that. I'd like to think that is still possible. I do think that it's still possible, though I think for a variety of reasons, there's many forces at work in American society today that make that hard and difficult. But this too, I think, remains a real possibility that is sometimes realized in practice in American society.
Okay, here are two more, I'd say, specific questions. From Laz Schneider first. To what extent are anti-Semitic incidents related to Islamic issues, especially regarding in relationship to Israel or otherwise? For example, Omar, to what can the increased Black anti-Semitism be attributed?
I mean, again, an interesting question. So my focus has been on the core group, on the American core group. And so this is really a question about groups outside of the core. This, in a way, I think, relates to Mari's question about France. So, so if the question is about anti-Semitism within Muslim communities in the United States, I have no doubt that it exists. But I think this is a much less of a problem in the United States than it is in a place like France, because Muslims as a percentage of the population in the United States is a much lower percentage of the population in the US than it is in France. So I don't see Muslims as the sort of primary source of anti-Semitism in this country. For one thing, there's not enough of them in order for them to play this role. So this is what I would say about the Islamic issues. In terms of sort of Muslims and Blacks, again, we're talking about other outgroups. And here I can simply repeat what I said in the paper about this, that I think we have to distinguish the sources when anti-Semitism does arise within other outgroups. We have to distinguish the factors at work, the dynamics there from the core group, because I think the dynamics are different. I think sometimes there is a kind of politics of resentment that is at work here. But I also think that an analysis of the degree to which anti-Semitism exists in these communities also has to take into consideration the way in which the multicultural incorporation of these groups has been less successful. This is, I'll just leave it there for now.
Thank you. Here is another specific question. I think we're beginning to wrap up. What is the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiments, i.e., the critical view of what the state of Israel has been doing to Arabs? To me, it seems paradoxical that alt-right figures like Trump are somehow supportive of the Israeli government while instigating anti-Semitic sentiments themselves.
Yeah, another great question. I would make a distinction. I would want to make a distinction between criticism of Israel, and right now, I think, and I'm speaking, just personally, not as a, this is not a sociological statement. This is a personal statement. Right now, I think there's a lot to criticize in the current government in Israel. I would distinguish that from anti-Zionism, and anti-Zionism I would think of as a kind of as yet another kind of political ideology in which the existence of a Jewish national homeland in Palestine is considered illegitimate. That it was illegitimate from the beginning, remains illegitimate, so this is a different, I think, a different kind of thing. I am certainly not somebody who thinks that criticism of Israel is inherently or by definition anti-Semitic. I don't even think that anti-Zionism is inherently anti-Semitic, although I think there's a lot of overlap between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism today. And the way that I tend to think about this is a way that here I'm influenced by Mitchell Cohen, who wrote a piece in 2003 along these lines, who talked about the ways that anti-Zionist discourses, ways of talking, ways of thinking, position Zionist or Israel in ways analogous to how anti-Semitism positions Jews. And that I actually think Cohen was onto something. I think there's a lot of evidence for that. That's what I tried to suggest in the paper as well.
Okay, I'm going to ask you, relay two more questions, and then we'll call it a day. By David Silverberg, it's a pretty long question, but I think it's an interesting one. He says he's piggybacking off a previous answer about Jewish incorporation into the dominant group, a la Badiou, etc. He says, I have a question about where the reassertion of whiteness as the primary defining sociological frame in the United States fits in. This seems important because, one, whiteness in the US is obviously unstable. There's a ton of work on the incorporation of different ethnic groups across disciplines. And two, because the Unite the Right event raised in this presentation clearly is hostile not just towards Jews, but to many other groups based on whiteness. So how are you factoring or not factoring in whiteness as an in-group identity?
Yeah, I have sort of bracketed the question in this paper. And I think really addressing this in the detail and depth that it needs to be would require a paper of its own. And there's a lot being written about this. I agree with the point about whiteness being something unstable. The boundaries of whiteness have been contested and shifted over time historically. There is so we know that. I would also say that whiteness is another one of these sort of primordial qualities by which the American core group has historically been defined. And the relationship of Jews to whiteness is sort of interesting one. Eric Goldstein and others have written about this very perceptively. I think this would have to be part of a wider conversation about core group and its relationship to outgroups in American history. But maybe the last thing I will say about this is that one of the things that sometimes bothers me about these sort of discussions about Jews and whiteness is I have the feeling sometimes that these discussions they start to revolve around the question of whether Jews are white, whether Jews have ever been white, when did they become white, are they still white, who has the authority to define Jews racially, and those are interesting questions. But what I worry about, I guess, is that in a way, I have a feeling that these discussions sometimes in a kind of Procrustean fashion try to squeeze Jews into other categories. And I'm always struck by the fact that anti-Semitism is something that Jews can suffer from and be victimized by, regardless of their racial status, of whether they're sort of perceived and defined as white or not. And I think this sometimes gets lost in these discussions. It sort of falls by the wayside when the discussion starts to be focused exclusively on color. Well, if we had more time, I would invoke some things that Du Bois wrote late in his life and late in his career about the Jewish question, where he sort of acknowledged that early in his career, he tended to think of racism, racial conflict exclusively in terms of color, and later came to see that it was a more multifaceted and more complicated kind of social phenomenon. And I tend to agree with Du Bois on this point. I think those kinds of things sometimes get lost, not necessarily, but sometimes get lost when the conversation shifts to questions about whiteness and the relationship of Jews to whiteness.
Thanks. I'm going to ask you the last question, then add on something from me which relates to that. Michael Olnick asks, do trends in anti-Semitic incidents and hate crimes necessarily index trends in anti-Semitism among the general American population? And I think that's a good question. And I was thinking that whether the indexing, you show the disturbing index, and we're all aware of it, of anti-Semitic incidents and hate crimes. And I think you know this from my own paper in our symposium, but is this to indicate an increase in anti-Semitic beliefs or an increase in public anti-Semitic actions? In other words, a kind of disinhibition, which doesn't mean that there's an increase of anti-Semitic beliefs. I don't want to, block out the first question. I think they're related to each other.
Yeah. Well, first I'll just say hello to Michael. Michael is a friend and colleague, so it's great that you're able to be here, Michael. So I focused on incidents for a couple of reasons. The data on incidents are readily available. There are sort of organizations that are collecting this data, and number one. Number two, I'm enough of a pragmatist to think that beliefs that don't have practical consequences are perhaps less interesting, and I think that's sort of a view that many people would hold. So of course we're concerned about anti-Semitic beliefs, but we're most concerned about those beliefs when they find expression in anti-Semitic action or anti-Semitic practices. The question of whether these incidents indicate a growth in beliefs or simply a a weakening of the prohibitions against acting on those beliefs or expressing those beliefs is an interesting one. I don't know the answer to that question. And I think the data that I have here that I used in this paper and that I presented in this paper doesn't allow us to answer that question. I think the ADL and some other Jewish groups are trying to get at the beliefs question more directly with survey data. The problem with that is if you want to see how these beliefs sort of change over time, you need a kind of longitudinal study, right? So it's not enough to have a snapshot of what the beliefs are this year. It doesn't tell us much if we don't know what the beliefs were, what they looked like 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 25 years ago. And I'm not sure there's really good longitudinal data about that. Maybe there is, but I'm not sure that there is. So I think it's an important question. It's a question that I'll say that I don't know the answer to, and I think it requires more research.
Chad, I want to thank you for this very stimulating paper about a subject that is immensely depressing, but your talk was not depressing, but inspiring, and your open-minded response to the questions has been just great. So thank you very much on behalf of this community, and we look forward to your work in the future.
Thanks so much.
Okay. Bye, everybody.